At first glance, Billy Wilder's The Apartment may very well look like a simple love story written and directed by a cinematic master at the height of his powers. However, behind Wilder's precise direction, the brilliantly written screenplay, and excellent lead performances of Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine, there's a lot more than meets the eye. As somebody who considers this film as an all-time favorite, I've decided to do a deep dive into the world of The Apartment. Hopefully, by discussing and contextualizing the film's history, I inspire someone else to love and appreciate it as much as I do. In this episode, I'll be talking about office culture and sexual politics in mid-century America, the conception and production of Billy Wilder's 1960 classic, its frank depiction of sex and misogyny, how the film changed the cinematic landscape of its time, its Oscar wins, and finally, its influence in pop culture. To further understand Billy Wilder's The Apartment, let's put into context the period in history in which the story was conceived. When World War II ended, the United States was in a better economic condition than most of the world. Public policy like the GI Bill of Rights provided veterans the opportunity to purchase homes with low-rate mortgages as well as tuition assistance to attend college. Corporate expansions also dominated 1950s America, resulting into more available jobs for the middle class. With more disposable income, Americans were spending more on big-ticket items such as television sets, cars, appliances, and homes. It was the era of the American dream. Suburbia was in fashion. After the war, people just wanted safety and security. And they got it. They embraced the social norms that dictated that men should be the breadwinner while women were the homemakers. In 1956, former Fortune magazine writer William H. White Jr. wrote The Organization Man, one of the most influential books on management ever published. In his text, the writer explains that white males succeeded in the workforce when they adhered to big corporation rules and social ethics rather than the go-it-alone individualism that America was founded on. To simplify it, these men were all about conformity. By following the rules and letting go of their individualism, they were rewarded. The Organization Man became a template for the soulless dirge of modern corporate life in which the individual is wholly subsumed in favor of the corporate entity, writes Study Smarter, which analyzes the text for educational purposes. This is a very narrow explanation of what White's text is about, so if you want to learn more about it, I recommend you seek it out. However, I think it's important to note its existence to show how attitudes were changing in post-war America. No longer was the common man eager to make his fortune by taking risks. He was perfectly comfortable as a devoted employee of a big conglomerate. On the other hand, women were also experiencing a major change in their societal roles. During the war, women were encouraged to become factory workers to contribute to the war effort while the men were away. When the war finally ended, they were asked to leave work and take up more traditional gender roles. Historian Vanessa Martins-Lamb writes in her dissertation that contemporary advertisements, films, radio broadcasts, and television shows encourage women to make marriage and having children their top priority. Once they were married, they should follow everything that their husbands say, as a way to thank them for risking it all on the battlefield. They were encouraged to be the perfect wife, who prepared the family's meals, took care of the children, and made sure that everything at home was running seamlessly. However, a handful of feminist figures and writers, such as Harriet Arnau, Betty Friedan, and Margaret Mead, made it a point to show American women that they should play greater roles in society rather than being just the housewife and mother. By the mid-1950s, women became more discontented with domestic family life. Lamb notes that in this period, there was an increase in women seeing therapists to try and explain their dissatisfaction, many of which complained that they felt alone and empty. In a way, this crisis was a turning point in women's lives. It was at this moment that they saw the need to grow up and become real, to leave the domestic world and look for new limits and aspirations, writes Lamb. The American woman of the 1950s was finally awakening from a long and well-planned unconsciousness. Women were searching their places in a society led by men. They were finding ways to escape the stereotypes by redefining roles and professional barriers to become a force of action and no longer simple spectators. Even with all the national efforts to maintain women in their housewife role, a great many of them were finding in work a way to fulfill a life that couldn't be completed only by family life. By 1955, American women were represented in almost 446 professions. However, these were mostly in male-led companies that didn't value their female workforce. Women were assigned to more feminine roles such as secretaries, teachers, phone operators, and, in Fran Kubelik's case, elevator girl. With women now regular figures in the workplace, inappropriate sexual advances and relationships between bosses and their female employees began to skyrocket, particularly between the boss and his secretary. By the early 20th century, the secretary had become a cultural type. Girls wanted to grow up to be one, boys thought they'd marry one, writes the BBC. The ideal candidate was someone who could be an office wife, matching the duties in the office that the wife did at home. Early manuals of secretarial skills read like guidelines to a successful marriage. Learn his preferences and obey them even if you do not always agree with his ideas or methods. Naturally, a man likes to have his wants attended to. Who doesn't? Assume that he is always right. This BBC article, entitled "The Era of the Sexually Charged Office," puts together a number of anecdotes from women secretaries of the 1930s to 50s who describe their relationships with their bosses, some of which end in violence and murder. In short, office politics was very much the wild, wild west back then. What we would consider today as sexual harassment was brushed off as boys being boys. Furthermore, the launch of Playboy magazine in 1953 solidified the idea of men as masters of the universe. While Hugh Hefner's Playboy philosophy encouraged the sexual liberation of both men and women, the magazine quickly became a lifestyle guide for the heterosexual white male. This was mostly due to the fact that the magazine featured nude women called playmates. The companion to the playmate was an urbane, culturally articulate bachelor, writes Carrie Pizzulo. The man idealized in Playboy was a challenge to the post-war standard of the stalwart family man and cold warrior. The Playboy bachelor was a happy, swinging single man about town. It's easy to forget how significant a portrayal that was at the time. That kind of man was usually shunned in the 1950s as neurotic and possibly homosexual. But the carefree bachelor, an aspiration for Hefner himself when he created Playboy, was self-conscious about his looks, his apartment, even his cooking skills. The apartment even features a brief scene in which Jack Lemmon briefly reads a Playboy in bed. With the rise of the women's liberation in the 1960s, things began to change slowly. Women were finally afforded the opportunity to get more high-powered positions beyond the typical secretary or elevator girl, particularly in more artistic industries like advertising. As feminism and counterculture rose, the popularity and business philosophy of William White's The Organization Man dropped drastically. In the 1980s, scholars would consider it obsolete as Wall Street reinvigorated the middle class's entrepreneurial spirit. By the late 1950s, the Austrian-born director Billy Wilder was well regarded in Hollywood as a risk-taking filmmaker who made pictures with sharp social commentary on subjects considered unacceptable screen material. He had already won 3 Oscars, for writing and directing the Best Picture winning The Lost Weekend in 1945, and for writing Sunset Boulevard in 1950. I won't be talking too much about Wilder's career before this point because I truly feel that it deserves an episode of its own. What you really need to know for now is that Wilder was on a hot streak in the 1950s. He followed up the success of Sunset Boulevard with a string of critical and financial hits like Stalag 17, Sabrina, The 7-Year Itch, and Witness for the Prosecution. In 1959, he would have his biggest financial success yet, with the gender-bending comedy Some Like It Hot starring Jack Lemmon, Tony Curtis, and Marilyn Monroe. It would be his first time working with frequent collaborators Jack Lemmon and screenwriter I.A.L. Diamond. There has been some controversy over where the idea of the apartment came from. Some historians note that the film was influenced by a Hollywood scandal in which a talent agent named Jennings Lang was caught having a tryst in the apartment of his subordinate. Then, there was actor Tony Curtis, who wrote in his autobiography that Wilder got the idea from him. Finally, New York columnist Sidney Skowski suggested that he had written an original treatment and had sent it to Wilder. However, director Cameron Crowe dispelled the rumors after interviewing the legendary filmmaker for his book Conversations with Wilder. Wilder rejects all these theories and gives credit to an unlikely source. Director David Lean, wrote Crowe for The Guardian. Seeing Lean's brilliant early film Brief Encounter about an adulterous affair conducted in the apartment of a third party, Wilder scribbled this idea in his notebook. What about the poor schnook who has to crawl into the still warm bed of the lovers? Years would pass before Wilder felt that he could slip this concept past the censors. In 1959, Wilder was finally ready to work on the screenplay with Diamond. They came up with the story of The Apartment, which follows the character of C.C. Baxter, C for Calvin, C for Clifford, however most people call him Bud, an employee at the Consolidated Life Insurance Company in New York City. To get ahead in the company, Baxter loans out his apartment to his bosses for their extramarital affairs. When the big boss, Mr. Sheldrake, begins to use the apartment, Baxter is heartbroken when he learns that Sheldrake's mistress is his office crush, the elevator girl, Fran Kubelik. And, 62-year-old spoiler alert, after a fight with Sheldrake, Fran attempts suicide in the apartment via drug overdose. Baxter discovers her body and saves her life with the help of a doctor neighbor. The two grow closer over the Christmas holidays as he nurses her back to health. However, Baxter is soon confronted with a big moral dilemma. Billy Wilder offered the lead role of the likable schnook C.C. Baxter to Jack Lemmon after a preview of Some Like It Hot. Wilder saw something in Lemmon that most of Hollywood couldn't. Although he had already won an Oscar for his supporting role in Mr. Roberts in 1955, Wilder knew that Lemmon had the potential of a leading man. He was unlike other male actors of the time. He wasn't tough like Robert Mitchum, nor was he the romantic lover like Rock Hudson. Instead, he was just a fun-loving, goofy guy. Lemmon was uniquely his own man. Wilder said that Jack Lemmon was my everyman, says film historian Bruce Block. He could do everything except kissing and love making scenes, but there was a little bit of genius in everything that he did. Wilder thought he was the purest, most professional actor he ever worked with. He said casting Lemmon was critical because Baxter has so few redeeming qualities other than wanting a career advancement. We had to have someone who could bring some additional sympathy to the role. For the role of Fran Kubelik, Wilder was tempted to cast Marilyn Monroe even after Some Like It Hot's turbulent production. When Monroe finally expressed that she wanted the role, Wilder resisted. It would not be real, he told Cameron Crowe. Everybody in the whole company would be after the elevator girl. Instead, he cast the relative newcomer Shirley MacLaine, who was fresh off a Best Actress Oscar nomination for her role in Vincent Minnelli's Some Came Running. Although MacLaine had already tasted critical acclaim, she was yet to be seen as a leading lady. Still, Wilder felt that the actress was perfect for the role. He thought that she was someone you'd miss at first glance, but by the second look, you would be infatuated. To round up the main cast, the director hired former Double Indemnity collaborator Fred McMurray for the role of Sheldrake. After his original choice, the actor Paul Douglas died from a heart attack right before filming. Cameras began to roll in New York City on November 17, 1959. However, the 4 days allotted for location shoots would prove to be nightmarish, as the extremely cold weather made it difficult for the cast and crew to work. Apart from a few shots outside of the titular apartment, the majestic theater lobby, and Central Park, Wilder would reshoot most of the sequences on sound stages at the Samuel Golden Studios back in California. The making of the apartment was done in typical Wilder fashion. Jack Lemmon, who was lucky enough to have had worked with Wilder just a few months back, was already on the same wavelength as his director. However, the 25-year-old Shirley MacLaine was extremely nervous, especially since she was only given 30 pages of the script at the start. This was a usual practice on Wilder productions, so that he could tailor-fit the roles to his actors as shooting went on. In addition, MacLaine wasn't used to Wilder's strict directorial style, which required his actors to say exactly what was written on the page. Wilder would chain smoke while pacing on set as his actors delivered long monologues. Co-writer Diamond would be nearby, policing the exact delivery of each line. If a single end or then would be out of place, Wilder would yell, "Cut," and they would start all over again. Every word mattered, even if they had to reshoot the same scene for days on end. Only Jack Lemmon was spared from the director's strictness, as he surprised Wilder with a few off-script improvisations such as this scene right here. I totally get it. I strongly feel that Wilder and Diamond's screenplay is one of the best ever written for the silver screen. I rewatched this film 5 times while writing this episode, and every line of dialogue in the script contributes to the bigger picture. Not one word is wasted. While many cinephiles consider The Apartment to be a masterclass in acting, directing, and writing, I feel that its other achievements have been overlooked. For instance, the production design of Alexander Troner is quite effective. The way he dresses up Baxter's apartment isn't only realistic, but captures a lot of blink or you'll miss it details that contributes a lot to the character's backstory. I should also mention his brilliant set of the Consolidated Life Insurance Office, which was actually built on a very small stage but utilized forced perspective visual tricks to make it look large. The desks behind Lemmon actually get smaller and smaller, and so does the actors. Whether Wilder used little people or children for his extras is still up for debate. Other aspects I admire in this film is Joseph Lashel's noir-esque cinematography, the melancholy music, and the sharp film editing. Production on The Apartment wrapped on February 12, 1960, with editing done in a matter of days. There was about 5 feet of unused film, Wilder told Crow. It was, he also recalls, one of the few occasions when he knew the power of the picture while filming. 4 months later, Billy Wilder's latest picture would have its world premiere in New York City on June 16, 1960. The movie-going audiences loved The Apartment when it was released in theaters. It became one of the highest-grossing pictures of 1960, earning $24 million against an estimated budget of $3 million. Unfortunately, the critics weren't as enthusiastic. While many reviewers celebrated the film's blistering social commentary and brave subject matter, others brushed it off as a tonally inconsistent romantic comedy melodrama. Other critics weren't as kind, like Hollis Alpert of the Saturday Review, who described the film as a dirty fairy tale. Then there was the Chicago American's Ann Masters, who told Wilder in person that he had made a dirty picture. Despite a mixed critical reaction, The Apartment was another triumph for Wilder and company that would change the landscape of American cinema forever. Billy Wilder was no stranger to controversial subject matter. In fact, even his 1950s comedies featured subversive themes. AV club writer Caroline Seed cites a few examples. Look to the infidelity at the heart of the 7-Year Itch, or the boundary-breaking drag shenanigans of Some Like It Hot. Even his feather-light romantic comedy Sabrina features a suicide attempt. For Wilder, who fled to Paris during the rise of the Nazi Party and whose mother, grandmother, and stepfather were killed in the Holocaust, lightness seldom exists without darkness. Today, many of these films probably look incredibly tame to modern lenses. Themes such as sex, suicide, and adultery are all featured fairly regularly on films and television. However, for the era in which they were made, these movies were considered to have very subversive ideas. For part 3 of this episode, I'd like to discuss how The Apartment pushed boundaries when it was first released in 1960. I'll break it down into 3 sub-chapters. First, I'll discuss the film's frank depiction of sex and sexuality, then its cutting-edge characterization of Fran Kubelik, and finally, its portrayal of office politics during the late 1950s and 60s. First of all, let's look into The Apartment's frank depiction of sex. In the early 1930s, Hollywood adopted the Motion Picture Production Code, or otherwise known as the Hays Code, a strict set of guidelines that dictated what was inappropriate to show in films. The code prohibited any profanity, nudity, graphic or realistic violence, drug abuse, rape, and any form of sexual persuasions. By the 1950s, the code was still in full effect. However, the growing popularity of foreign films amongst American moviegoers worried the studios. These racier films, by the likes of Roberto Rossellini and Jack Clayton, were not censored by the code. The rise of television was also a major concern for the big studios. People enjoyed watching TV at home, and the Hollywood bigwigs were desperate to find ways to get butts back into theater seats. By 1959, the code's influence was dwindling quickly, prompting studios to release pictures with more daring subject matter. Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot did not meet the code's original guidelines due to its depiction of infidelity, cross-dressing, and allusions to sex and homosexuality. Yet, it found its way to theater screens to great critical and financial success. Due to the triumph of Some Like It Hot, Wilder finally had the confidence that The Apartment would make it past the censors. Although the finished product never showed the act of sex on screen, its strongly suggestive nature and dialogue was considered shocking by audiences in 1960. The film ushered in the final decline of Hollywood's era of self-censorship, particularly in regard to dealing with complex adult sexual relationships, supported in this quest by the release of 3 impressive European films on similar topics: Hiroshima Mon Amour, Lady Chatterley's Lover, and Room at the Top, writes Gerd Gomenden in his book A Foreign Affair. In the same week The Apartment was released, another controversial and racy film also made its way into theaters, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which we'll probably talk about more in depth in another episode. At the center of the film's main sexual relationship is our female lead, Fran Kubelik, played by Shirley MacLaine. This is a good time to segue into part 2 of what made The Apartment such a groundbreaking film, because they are pretty connected. The characterization of Fran Kubelik. The female images that dominated American cinema of the 1950s were that of the glamorous woman. Think Audrey Hepburn dancing in a Givenchy gown, or the aristocratic Grace Kelly staking out a murderer in an Edith Head creation, or Marilyn Monroe dressed to the nines while walking the streets of New York City. Fran Kubelik existed outside the box of the usual Hollywood glamour girl type. She didn't wear couture, her makeup is never perfect, and she doesn't get a fairy tale ending. Fran, a realistic working woman open to sex, was a cutting-edge creation for her time period. In addition, her character arc focused mainly on the taboo subject of suicide. Today, many scholars believe her frank characterization and deviation from the glamorous 50s starlet image began a major shift on how audiences saw their female leads. Gerd Gumenden writes, "In contrast to the films of this period, which, according to Molly Haskell, were all about sex but without sex, The Apartment clearly implies premarital and adulterous sexual relationships, and the fact that Fran still ends up with the hero rather than being the punished in some way demonstrates the drastically different way in which films began to represent the changing role of women in society in the 1960s. Fran is a self-determined young woman, notable by the fact that she cuts her hair short and that she wears a flower in her lapel of her uniform, even though that is against regulations, who does not blame Jeff Sheldrake but only her own naivete for ending up with the fuzzy end of the lollipop. The biggest reason, at least in my opinion, and why the characterization of Fran Kubelik works so well is because of the wonderful performance of Shirley MacLaine. The actress never forgets to add nuance into her portrayal. She plays Fran with numerous shades of sour and sweet, melancholia and warmth, ultimately giving audiences a fully realized, breathing human being. Caroline Seed says it best in her essay for the AV Club. In MacLane's hands, Fran is sometimes wise, sometimes naive young working woman caught between the old-fashioned values of the Eisenhower era and the swinging sexual revolution to come. The actress sells every bit of it, sinking her teeth into every second of her screen time. Today, a lot of people have argued that Fran's character hasn't exactly aged well. In fact, while researching this episode, I found so many articles online that called her character out for being anti-feminist. Look, I'm no expert on feminism, so I can't say if I agree completely, but in the context of the films of this period, it's hard to deny that there was ever a female character like Fran Kubelik in mainstream American cinema until The Apartment. This leaves us to our final subchapter, the film's portrayal of office politics. The Apartment is considered an important film in terms of its portrayal of mid-century office politics, particularly workplace misogyny and sexual harassment. We experience this in the film by following two male characters with opposing personalities. The first is our lead CC Baxter, a loner employee who is willing to do anything to please his bosses, and Jeff Sheldrake, the philandering executive who has slept with multiple women in the office. While writing The Organization Man, author William White attended a training program at General Electric where a young man was taught, to get ahead, he must cooperate with the others, but cooperate better than they do. When I read this line, all I could think about was CC Baxter and how his bosses at Consolidated Life Insurance took advantage of him. The Apartment was written in 1959, during the height of The Organization Man's success. Since it was published in 1956, the book would become a bestseller and would frequently be reprinted throughout the 1960s. The character of Baxter is a great example of the loyal corporate manager that White writes about in his book. In fact, he is the organization man, an employee who is promised success as long as he complies without any major missteps. He is a man obsessed with safety and security. Even if Baxter is kind to women like Fran, he still plays an integral role in the patriarchal system by loaning out his apartment to his bosses. By doing this, he benefits from the mistreatment of women, both the mistresses and the wives. Even after finding Fran unconscious from her drug overdose, he continues to cover up Sheldrake's tracks. He eventually climbs to the top of the corporate ladder, becoming Sheldrake's personal assistant with access to the executive washroom. No matter how much Jack Lemmon makes Baxter a warm and likable guy, the truth is, he was motivated by selfish reasons. Luckily for the audience, Baxter gets a redeeming character arc when he realizes that what he was doing is wrong. He quits his job and decides to be a mensch, a human being. Baxter is no longer the organized man, but one of the few lucky ones who escaped the soulless corporate machine of mid-century America. On the other end of the spectrum is Jeff Sheldrake, played by Fred McMurray. Wilder and Diamond decide to make this character the story's ultimate villain. He is unsympathetic, has no redeeming qualities, and does not go through any personal growth at all. He's even cruel enough to keep his ex-lover as his secretary while carrying on affairs with other women in the office. The character of Sheldrake is representative of misogynistic white male executives that preyed on the female workforce during this period. Recall what I mentioned earlier on this episode about the aspiring playboy bachelor who bedded his female subordinates with no care of the consequences. That is Sheldrake. Beyond mistreating women, the character also has no respect for his male colleagues working below him. He is power-hungry and selfish, and everyone exists only to serve his every whim. Today, modern writers have pointed out the film's incredible portrayal of toxic office culture, even comparing Sheldrake to the notorious men accused during the rise of the Me Too movement. Some commentators, like Nina Metz from the Chicago Tribune, has even written about how the movie's lovelorn arc has pulled focus away from the film's most important theme, the structural and institutionalized harassment still very evident in today's society. On April 17, 1961, the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences were honoring the best films of 1960 in a ceremony held at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium. The Apartment was up for 10 Oscars that evening, leading the pack as the film with the most nominations. By all accounts, The Apartment was the frontrunner to win the Best Picture Oscar, especially after the poor showing of Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus, which was expected to land a nomination but didn't. Hitchcock's Psycho also had its fans, but John Wayne's extensive campaigning for his directorial debut, The Alamo, is believed to have bumped Psycho out of the Best Picture lineup. Arguably, The Apartment's only true threat for the win was the evangelist drama Elmer Gantry, which won 3 statues including Best Adapted Screenplay and 2 acting awards. Ultimately, The Apartment would win 5 Oscars, 3 of which would go to Billy Wilder for producing, directing, and co-writing the screenplay. It was a historic night for the director, as he became the first person in history to achieve such a feat in a single evening. Alexander Troner and Edward G. Boyle won for their art direction and set decoration, respectively, while Daniel Mandel was victorious in the category of Best Film Editing. Unfortunately, Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine lost their bids for their triumphant leading performances. This makes me extremely sad, because Lemmon's C.C. Baxter is my favorite leading man performance of all time, while MacLane's Miss Kubelik is high on the list as well. But it is what it is, I guess. Burt Lancaster would walk away with Best Actor for playing the titular Elmer Gantry, which, okay, I kinda get it. He was good enough, and he was much more respected than Lemmon at the time. Plus, Lemmon already had an Oscar, while Lancaster, a leading man for over a decade, was yet to be recognized. But Elizabeth Taylor for Best Actress... where to begin? Her win for Butterfield 8 isn't only one of the worst this category has ever seen, but it is widely agreed by historians that she won via pity vote after a life-threatening throat surgery. Can I just say, wow. Instead of Shirley MacLaine's cutting-edge, emotional, nuanced performance, we get this. But again, it is what it is, and there's no point harping on about it. I'm just happy that The Apartment was able to bring home the Best Picture Oscar. Many people, myself included, rarely agree with the Academy's pick in this category. So, to see them make the right choice for once is really very satisfying. In fact, I think this is one of the greatest wins the category has ever seen. The Apartment is often overshadowed today by many of Billy Wilder's more popular and iconic films, but it continues to stay in the public consciousness, outside of hardcore cinephiles, simply because it has the honor of being a Best Picture winner. While the film can stand on its own merits, the Oscar citation has definitely helped keep its legacy alive today. Before ending this episode, I'd just like to speak a little bit about how influential The Apartment has been in pop culture, even when most people don't realize it. For instance, the showrunner of Mad Men has cited the movie as one of the show's major influences. The character of CC Baxter has also become an archetype for leading men in later romantic comedies. Think Hugh Grant's babbling in Notting Hill, or even Tom Hanks's everyman persona established in films like Sleepless in Seattle. Some rom-coms have even paid tribute to the film directly, like in 1989's When Harry Met Sally, which sets its famous finale on New Year's Day, just as The Apartment did. In 1968, Neil Simon adapted The Apartment into a hit Broadway musical called Promises, Promises. Furthermore, many office-based stories like 9 to 5 and Working Girl took their cues from Billy Wilder by combining social commentary with comedy. Before I say goodbye, I hope you've learned a lot about The Apartment from this episode. If you haven't seen it already, you should definitely give it a shot. If I can inspire another person to be a big fan of this film, I think I've done what I've set out to do. Because The Apartment deserves to be seen. It's a masterpiece. Movie-wise, acting-wise, writing-wise, directing-wise, and otherwise-wise.